Welcome to our UM-NSU CARD Summer Institute. We also will be having another Summer Institute in July, so be on the lookout for that. I'm Dr. Jennifer DeRocher. I'm the director of UM-NSU CARD. For those of you who don't know what CARD is, CARD stands for the Centers for Autism and Related Disabilities, and we are a state-funded discretionary project through the Department of Education, providing individual support to families, as well as consultation to teachers and other professionals in the community, and public education and training opportunities. I also want to mention a quick note about our PEPSA grant, which is sponsoring this workshop. PEPSA stands for the Partnership for Effective Programs for Students with Autism, and they provide two opportunities: one, to host regional trainings like we're offering today, and also allows educators and other school-based professionals to be paired with CARD staff to develop year-long projects to enhance practices in their schools. If you're interested in that, please reach out to us at CARD. Because we have a short time frame today, I'm going to move right on to introducing our speaker. And it is my sincerest honor and pleasure to be introducing our speaker today, Dr. Aaron Fisher. So I'm going to read his brief bio, but add a few comments at the end. So Dr. Fisher is the D. Endowed Professor of School Psychology, an adjunct assistant professor of psychiatry, and director of the Uni-Home Interdisciplinary Pediatric Feeding Disorders Clinic at the University of Utah. He's a licensed psychologist and also a licensed board-certified behavior analyst. He has worked with individuals with ASD and social, emotional, and behavioral problems and their families for over 15 years. And his current research focuses on telehealth applications to support behavior and mental health for children, educators, and caregivers. So that's a bit about Dr. Fisher. I am just so thrilled to be able to have him come speak to you all today. Dr. Fisher and I go way back. He has a very long history with CARD and the University of Miami. He was one of our research assistants over 15 years ago. He has gone on to have one of the most successful careers of any of the undergraduates who've worked with us. And it just brings me such joy to see the wonderful work he's doing and to be able to have him back at the U speaking to you on his area of expertise. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Fisher, and please help me virtually welcome him.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. And Jen, thanks so much for inviting me, and for the Center for Autism for inviting me. I'm very excited to be with you all this morning to talk about this work that's very, very important to me. And I hope that through the next couple days, we have the chance to learn together and hopefully empower you all with some more skills and some more knowledge so that you can take back and work with students with autism spectrum disorder who you work with. So for the next couple days, we're really going to focus on best practices in teleconsultation to support students with autism spectrum disorder. And as we jump in, I want to kind of recognize where a lot of this got started. And like Jen had mentioned earlier in the introduction, which I really appreciated, I did get my start at the UM-NSU CARD on the Coral Gables campus. And I'm always thinking about the experiences I had there, the communities that we served, and really how that ingrained for me the need to help our community in really substantive ways, particularly those with disabilities and those who may be marginalized in other ways. And so this picture you see here is me circa 2003. I'm doing some of the amazing work that we were doing back at CARD. And I think it's just really important to go that full circle. I also want to give a shout out to the folks that I get to work with here at the University of Utah in the lab that I developed back when I came in 2014. This is the University of Utah Technology and Training Education and Consultation Lab. We have over 30 members of undergraduates, of graduate students, of postdoc fellows, and staff psychologists and behavior analysts who are just really passionate about implementing and transforming schools for the better for students with disabilities, as well as students who might be marginalized, students who are Black, students who are Indigenous, and students of color and their families who really we need to make overt intentional supports for our community and in the schools. And so our work is really around transforming these environments to help support those students. And we do this through multi-tiered mental health programs, where we have school-wide mental health for all students. We have multi-tiered behavior supports and consultation, where we're in schools, particularly Title I schools in the Utah Valley, helping students who really need more positive behavior supports in their communities, much more social emotional learning, and really trying to transform not only schools but classrooms to empower teachers and educators to really help students and ensure that they have the same equitable opportunities as some of their peers. We also do some integrated public day treatment programs, public school day treatment programs, where we're really working with students with the most acute need in these districts to help keep them out of community-based psychiatric institutes or other inpatient mental health settings, because we really feel strongly that every student can learn, every student can do better, and we can help support them to the extent we can help in their schools and particularly their neighborhood schools. We also do a ton of professional development. I'm super excited that you all are here today. This is one of my favorite things we get to do, is just learn together about new topics. And then of course we do a lot around functional assessment, function-based treatment planning, and teleconsultation, which is really going to be the highlight of the next couple of days, is all this teleconsultative work. And I'd be remiss if I didn't give a shout out and recognition to all of the school districts listed on this slide that have helped us through our time doing this work, and who have committed to partnerships with the University of Utah and our lab to execute this work. This is Washington County School District, Granite School District, Canyon School District, Salt Lake City School District, and the Cambia Health Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization by Blue Cross Blue Shield in the Pacific Northwest that funds our school mental health project. So thanks again to all those folks. As we jump into content for today, we're going to go through a lot, and I'm going to do my best to make this as approachable, as digestible for you as I can. Please feel free to ask questions. We'll have some engagement opportunities through polls. I have a lot of multimedia content to try to make this stuff super salient for you, but please ask your questions. We're going to have 30 minutes at the end, and I'm really interested to hear how I can support you all. For today, we're going to talk about how to conceptualize teleconsultation to support students with ASD and their families. We're going to also talk a lot about how technology features, we can consider them when selecting video conferencing software. That's going to be really important. We're also going to understand the research base for teleconsultation to support families and children and students with ASD. This is going to be really critical. And then also how we can use a problem-solving model, one that I like to use, and we'll talk more about that later, to really systematically solve the smallest to the largest problems that you might have when you're interacting. And then last but not least, considering applications of teleconsultation to support students with ASD and their families, some real practical examples. And then we'll dive in much more tomorrow to really some of the kind of features, what you can do to actually make this stuff useful. All right, so for our first engagement opportunity, I would love for you all to be able to fill out the poll and tell me what you all do. I had a chance to talk to you a little bit about the work that we do, but I'm really interested to know what you do and how you help students with ASD. And you'll see that poll pop up on your screen. I'll give you a couple seconds here to fill that one out. Okay, well, as you're filling this out, think about what typically happens in schools. And the last few months have been largely transformative. They've been different on many reasons in our society. And if we think about what this looked like before COVID-19 hit, this is probably your day-to-day work in some capacity. You're either doing therapeutic work, you're working with students with ASD and their families, you are maybe meeting with them in small groups, you're helping support teachers with some of the services that you might provide individually. And you may be teaming a lot with folks to see how you can help these students. And I think this is really important. I appreciate everyone who was able to participate. It looks like the majority of folks here are school psychologists and community psychologists, behavior analysts, and teachers. And this is excellent to see. You all have really critical roles for helping students with ASD. And I hope that throughout today, there, again, like I said, that there's a few more tools in your toolbox and some ideas that you can benefit from. Okay, so this was the standard way we were practicing. And I would say that we were very privileged to experience it in this in-person format, particularly over the past few months when we've realized how challenging it can be to serve students particularly students with disabilities, or those who can't access technology during this time. And I think as we go through today and tomorrow, I want everyone to orient with me that this is for the students who can engage with technology. This is for students whose parents can engage with the technology, who have the ability to do those things. We will spend some time, particularly tomorrow, talking about how do you serve those students who we can't access through teleconsultation. So again, this next 2 days isn't going to be the end all be all, but I really want to empower you all with some new tools that you can use in your practice. So about 4 months ago, COVID-19 hits our communities nationwide and across the world. And the immediate question is, how do we serve students, particularly students with autism spectrum disorder, now that we have this new modality of practicing and we can't be in person? What do we do? And the immediate answer that everyone went to practically overnight was telehealth. And for me, as a telehealth researcher, this was super exciting. It was a weird moment because I've been spending the past 8 years studying this topic with decent interest, but I wouldn't say the amount of use that we see today. And what it made me realize was we made a quick shift. It was great to see people mobilize, but we really needed to take kind of a step back and think about what should we be doing in an ethical practice standpoint. And so this is where I'd encourage people to take pause and think, what are these considerations for my practice in whatever capacity that is, and how can I help support students with autism in an evidence-based way, in a sound best practice way? So here's some questions I want you all to consider, and I hope that these sort of go through your mind as we're going through the next 2 days and beyond. The first question is what's the evidence for teleconsultation? I mean, everyone went and did a bunch of telehealth work. Many of you maybe did teleconsultation, but what is the evidence for that? We also should think about, are there certain frameworks we should follow? Are there certain kind of systematic approaches that we should be doing to make this work? Is telehealth safe and secure? This is one that always comes to mind for me. It's one of the biggest questions I get. And I think we've seen people in the shuffle of trying to get telehealth services in place and distance ed services in place, trying to make sense of some of these things. Do I have a video conferencing software platform? Am I using FaceTime on my phone, or am I using some other tool? And I think these are really important considerations. And then how do I engage caregivers and educators? People who are really integral to helping support students with autism. And last but not least, what about those who can't engage or don't engage? This is also a reality. And I think as we talk about everything the next couple of days, please start thinking about this as an augmentative tool. Okay, so this is going to lay the groundwork for a lot of the work that we will be talking about, that we will be doing. So as we jump in, let's talk broadly about technology. Technology can be defined in the most broad sense as professional improvements in efficiency, accuracy, or ability. And I really like this definition. And technology is integral to the work I do. I'm a technology researcher, so I'm always thinking of innovative ways we can use current technologies to help support our practice. Because I don't know about you all, but I'm always at a shortage of time. I'm always trying to run around and make more meetings than I can probably make. And the travel time, the just back-to-back scheduling can be really taxing. When we think about technology and the importance of it and how it can be helpful, Gilman in '89 has this great quote talking about being computer literate is becoming as important as being literate in the traditional sense when it comes to reading. Computing is the new basic in education. This was in 1989. In 2020, this same quote rings as true as ever. And we have to be conscientious as educators, as mental health providers, as related service providers, as parents, whoever it may be, that we have to be as competent with technology, and because it has huge implications. It allows access. It also allows us to be able to oversee what our children, our students are doing. Knowledge is power, and I think that the extent we can be knowledgeable about this, it can have profound effects. When we think about technology in schools, what we know is that although there's a lot of increasing availability of technology, many teachers and school staff don't really maximize their technology use. And many, if not most of the times, it really comes down to a lack of training. At least all the school districts that I have the privilege of working in, Many of the teachers are eager to incorporate these things, but it's another add-on to the list of the multiple tasks that have to get done. And typically, departments for IT and educational technology within school districts aren't differentiating instruction to the extent possible for their adult learners to make sure that they have the adequate skills. And so I really see it as a skill deficit. I think there's some motivational pieces where it kind of feels scary. It kind of feels like you might break something. But what we found, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, is when you experience technology and you actually do the work, it gets easier. You get more comfortable with it. You get more confident. And that seems like most things that we do in our lives. So I just would encourage everyone to think how we can continue to incorporate technology. Another really important piece as we talk about teleconsultation is just thinking broadly about telehealth service provision. Teleconsultation would be one arm of this, and that's on the right side of your screen, the indirect services. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that is. And for many of you, your services, previous to moving to a more technology-based instruction, were all direct services. So you were in small groups, so the blue dot being the individual providing the services to these purple dots, which would be the students in small groups or individual instruction. And the technology mediation piece kind of comes in where those black lines are, being able to kind of navigate that experience. Okay, so let's jump in and talk a little bit specifically about teleconsultation. When we think about teleconsultation, I think it's important to first outline who are the important individuals within this model. The first one would be related service providers, and this is going to be called the consultant. And this individual could be a school psychologist, a behavior analyst, it could be a community psychologist, administrator, it could even be a teacher, depending on what models we're using. The next person is the educator or caregiver. This is typically the consultee. And then the last person is the client. And this is the student or child who is ultimately benefiting from our services. And within this model, the idea is the consultant uses all of their skills and knowledge and ability to socially influence other adults to change their behavior in positive ways and constructive ways to then impart those skills to the individual they work with or their own child. And in a more traditional model, there is also this opportunity for the consultant to put eyes on the student and child. And this is really important because we value the educator and caregiver as the local expert. This person knows their stuff. They know their student that they're working with. But more importantly, we also want to be able to verify these things. And so being able to objectively look at what's going on in a classroom or at home really gives full context, because sometimes people who are really close to the most difficult situations have a lot of emotions tied to that. And I know for me, when my emotions get heightened, it becomes harder to clearly see objectively all the nuance that could be happening. So it's this really collaborative effort to really understand what is going on. And so if you could, with the poll, just respond yes or no if you provide these types of consultative services. And as you're filling that out, let me talk a little bit about the teleconsultation piece. And so that element comes in where we interact with the educator, the caregiver, the consultee, or the client. Let's talk a little bit about synchronous versus asynchronous versions of teleconsultation and telehealth really at large. When we think about synchronous, we're thinking about live interactive content, dynamic interactions in real time, what we're doing right now. If you're watching later on the webinar, this would actually be asynchronous. But if you're joining me live right now, this is the really interactive pieces. And it approximates in-person interaction. And so I'm a behavior analyst. And as a behavior analyst, there's always semantics of language. And I think one of the important semantics for me is that we start to consider telehealth services as a face-to-face format. I think in-person should be reserved for the tangible in the space work that you're doing. Whereas us connecting right now, this is face-to-face. Maybe not so much dynamically face-to-face, but if I were on a call and I saw folks on the other end, that very much would be. And thanks for everyone who responded. It seems like almost 75% of you do consultative practices, which is excellent. I'm very biased, but I think this is a great way to affect many people and to really make change. Thanks for everyone who filled that out. The other end of this would be the asynchronous, self-paced work. So if you're thinking about distance education, online learning, Canvas or Blackboard or other tools that you can put stuff forever essentially online and interact with it when it's convenient. And it has maybe elements to drive progress, badges and other gamified elements. It has other kind of checkpoints along the way. And these things can be really helpful to motivate, but also organize and deliver online instruction. So now that we kind of have an orientation about how these services are delivered and what these might entail, and we'll dive in a little bit more, particularly tomorrow, about some of these. I want to talk about the characteristics of teleconsultation from kind of a 10,000-foot view of the work. So on the right, you all are probably familiar with this multi-tiered system of support triangle. What's really important to note is that as you go up the triangle, the severity of problem that needs to be addressed increases, and the intensity of those services goes up as well. And what's really important is that this model is the foundation for most of the work, if not a lot of the work that we're really trying to deliver to students who are receiving special education services, particularly students with autism spectrum disorder. Without this triangle, without these multi-tiered systems of social, emotional, and behavior academic supports, if we just are providing special education supports, we're really missing the mark. And this is where a lot of our work comes into schools, is making sure that students with disabilities and other students who are marginalized are accessing inclusive practices where they can get tier 1 instruction in the classroom, where they can get tier 1 behavior supports in the classroom, like the good behavior game. And so there really is profound effects when you can develop this model, but it's about orienting our mindset to know that this is how we must practice and ensure that these are in place. For those who may be less familiar, tier 1 are going to be your primary prevention services. This is going to be every student in the school gets it. At tier 2, these are going to be secondary prevention. It's going to be more targeted. You may be familiar with things like check in, check out. And these are going to be not individualized, but broadly applied to a smaller group of students who may be requiring services. And at the tier 3 level, this tertiary prevention, this would be all those individualized supports. And this is when we're really starting to make sure that we have nuanced decisions. We're looking at how this is differentiated, how an intervention is differentiated for the students we're working with. And then of course, special education services, tiers 1 through 3 plus. And this is when we're seeing all hands on deck, all resources available at schools to make this individualized, comprehensive plan that would be beyond the tier 3 supports that maybe we developed as a pre-referral intervention before students are classified in the school setting. Okay, so this lays some of the groundwork that I think is super, super critical. And as we move forward, I want to start talking about kind of the historical context of teleconsultation and give you kind of a walkthrough about this work and kind of where it came about, especially kind of in the mid 2000s, late 2000s. So first and foremost, our early school teleconsultation work really hinged around behavior assessment and treatment in schools. Prior to this work, when I was doing my initial research, which was back in about 2010, 2011, I found that speech and language pathology were some of the trailblazers of this type of work in schools. Now, not necessarily around the consultative piece, but around the direct service provision, where they were actually doing speech and language sessions with students through this virtual format. When we think more about the consultative approach, again, us indirectly supporting people, this is when we started to see a variety of folks, but particularly highlight Wendy McCullochek at the University of Oregon, who really, in my opinion, was kind of an early professional kind of person that I really looked to in the field, had done some fantastic work, really showing that with just ubiquitously available technology, FaceTime, we can access teachers, we can support things like preference assessments, functional behavior assessments, and behavior intervention plans. And so this work was super inspiring for me. And as we go through the rest of the content, it won't necessarily be in chronological order, but I'm going to kind of try to talk to you all about this as I think it's relevant within the process. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what software we should be using when doing teleconsultation. My colleagues, who I feel really fortunate to work with, who are listed on this publication, and I were able to really look at, and this was in 2016, which software was going to be the most beneficial. Because as you can imagine, there's a lot of software that's out there. I would say almost every social media app, or many social media apps now have video conferencing capabilities. So it's becoming even increasingly more ubiquitous. But we said we want to do this kind of in a more systematic fashion. And so here's a little bit of our method. We wanted to first identify software programs that we could use. We didn't want to just say, well, we like this one, or this is one that's been available by our university. We wanted to have some empirical basis. So we identified candidate programs. We reviewed associated telehealth literature. We also had some inclusion and exclusion criteria. After that, we coded a variety of software programs and evaluated the support for the research. We found 74 candidate software programs. That was a lot. That was listed in the literature. And we really did this broad net review. We went to all fields, not just schools. We wanted to see what have people used when it comes to video conferencing. Only 12 candidate programs, or about 16% of our search articles that use these, mentioned specifically which software in the literature. So, or only listed these 12 programs in the literature. And 7 mentioned in 2 or more of these empirical studies. And the important part for that is that really not many of these softwares have been robustly tested across studies, which is what we're trying to look for as researchers, is this replicability. And the search that we identified was able to have 5 current or surviving programs that have been used in at least 2 empirical studies. And these are the ones listed on the right side of your screen. Adobe Connect, Cisco WebEx, Polycom, Skype, and FaceTime. Okay. This is a helpful figure that really breaks down some of the features. So as we're looking and deciding on these software that we could use, what we thought was, you know, a lot of these software is, maybe it's not about naming the software, it's about the features of the software, because that's what allows us to engage robustly through this format with individuals who are serving. And so the check marks talk about if this software feature was available. And one that's really important for me, if not the most important, was this HIPAA and FERPA compliance. And of the software that we looked at, Adobe Connect and Polycom were ones that explicitly included this. And we'll talk a little bit more about HIPAA and FERPA compliance later. But what I want to do now is go through and talk about each of the different features through our study, and to show you a little bit about how you might benefit from this work. And it may feel a little bit meta. I'm going to use screenshots and videos from the work that we've done in my lab with my lab members to kind of give you some of these examples. Okay. So the first one that I think is really important that our study highlighted was that a variety of different providers were using on-screen document sharing. We saw this in telepathology, in literacy tutoring, and in surgery mentoring. And let me show you a little bit about what this would look like.
For which part, Shankan? Sorry, the like University of Utah birth manual?
Yeah, like these infographics and stuff, you know, like for the logos, you know.
My concern about doing it not every page is if one person uses just a page of our manual, there will be no way to know who is the person who created that. You know what I mean? So I think we want to have like a standard footer that includes credit to our team. And we can shrink those logos down. I mean, those are pretty large on the page. It can be a half an inch. I think that would be fine to maximize more room.
Okay, and sorry about that, everyone. It looked like for that one that the video didn't play. So I'm just gonna scroll through this quickly so you can see, you heard me talk already, you don't need to see that again. But this was me and my postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Sheng-Tien Wu, talking a little bit while using a screen share about the importance of being able to have logos. But this is just really showing you the dynamic process that you can use when interacting with other folks. Okay. The next one that's really important is the ability to have multiple users within a group. And for me, This is a picture of one of our lab meetings. We were celebrating one of our lab members who got married, and we wanted to do a quick video to support that. But this is traditionally what a group meeting looks like. Many of you probably have had this experience. We'll talk a lot about how using multiple users could be beneficial. But really what we saw in the literature as we were searching was the ability for multiple people to log in. And the way that the literature that we reviewed saw it was to help pre-service folks with training. And so multiple supervisors could join in at once and look. Of course, this has applications to IP meetings, team meetings, and a variety of other contexts where I think it's important to have many people in one room, and then we just aren't always able to do that. Another really, really critical piece is instant messaging, or the chat features that are available in many of these softwares. And for me, I think I'm constantly using the chat. I'm dynamically trying to have conversations with individuals I'm working with, but especially in group formats, other people may have something they want to say or chime in. And I always encourage the chat as a way to have dynamic conversation while two people maybe are talking and others maybe don't feel as comfortable to interrupt or feel less comfortable with the kind of video conferencing interaction. When looking at the literature we reviewed, we saw distance education was using this a ton. It was a way to engage in discussion, ask questions, and was really allowed the opportunity for more feedback, and students were more comfortable when they had that chat feature. So it's something I think that's really, really critical. Another really important part is recording capabilities. And so with recording capabilities, and this is something that's going on right now, this is a webinar that's being recorded, we have now the opportunity to have permanent products of meetings, of observations with students, of any of the consultative work we may do. And I think recordings are really, really helpful because not everyone can view things at the same time. Not everyone can participate in things at the same time. And so what we try to do to increase access is record as many lab meetings as we can where people can't join. We try to be able to have these products, video recordings stored on cloud storage, which we'll get to in a second, so that people can access these things. And in the literature, what we found was that people were recording all sorts of stuff. Interviews with graduate students regarding distance learning. They were transcribing these for later. Just distance education in general. We talked about asynchronous content, putting stuff up later for people to view. Training clips. I love this one because this is one that I'm really passionate about, is getting recordings of evidence-based practices in very digestible, very approachable forms. We'll show you some of the attempts that we've had in a little bit to try to do that. And then also just enhancing pre-service teachers' practicum experience, particularly those who are in rural or remote and underserved areas. We may not be able to drive down all the time to schools if they're 40, 50 miles apart, but being able to record sessions is going to be really critical. Now, remember, if you're recording, there are HIPAA and FERPA issues. We'll talk about those, but just to keep those on the back of your mind. And of course, this really promotes student collaboration. Recording videos is an amazing feature. Outside of like the video conferencing apps you might be using, there's also great software that we like to use, things like Flipgrid. It's an educational technology tool where it's really all video-based conversations and discussions. Okay, the next area is cloud storage. And some of the video conferencing platforms you may be considering have integrated cloud storage. One that comes to mind for me would be our Google Teams or our Google Suite that we use. And I really appreciate that because it allows me to store and share. I can also have a Google Meet if I need to. And so some of my projects use that. Our predominant software that we use is Zoom. And they don't pay us to use their software. We have kind of no disclosure with them, but we really appreciate all the features. But one that we think would be helpful would be the cloud-based storage, because that would be a nice way to kind of have one-stop shop for everything. On campus here at the University of Utah, we use Box, which is a HIPAA and FERPA compliant version. And what's being used in cloud storage, at least in the research when we look through these, is the ability to share materials like you would probably on your day-to-day. And I think for most of us, cloud storage is becoming such an integral piece, whereas even 5 years ago, I think there are still people who are not as comfortable or not as commonly using some of these cloud-based folders. And last but not least, in our study, we mentioned HIPAA and FERPA compliance. I'm going to spend so much time tomorrow talking about these things. It's super important. And if you have questions, no worries. This is one that's always on my mind. And last, outside of our study, I really wanted to highlight there's a lot of new features that our study wasn't able to identify because of just the time that these were taken from. Technology moves rapidly, and some of these have been introduced only in the past few years. And these are things like virtual backgrounds, waiting rooms, multiple screen sharing, breakout groups, digital whiteboards, and polls. We're using polls today, which is great, but stay tuned. There's gonna be a lot more of each of these formats tomorrow, and we're gonna talk about how to use these. I'll show you a little bit about how you might interact with them. I think they're fantastic. I'm seeing more and more video conferencing software companies integrating these types of features, which can just really promote engagement. And you'll hear me talk a lot about engagement. I think when it comes to working with students, particularly students with autism spectrum disorder, engagement has to be on the forefront. If we are not getting students engaged, are they really learning? Are they really attending to what we're trying to get them to be proficient at? I don't know. I would argue that they aren't. I know that in class, when we look in person, that we say academic engagement is one of the biggest predictors of student success. And I'd like to see those same levels of engagement in maybe different ways because of the technology be on the forefront of our minds. Okay, so now hopefully you're all with me saying, I kind of feel okay about picking a software, but what about the larger evidence of this work? And what can I do with it? So one of the next studies that we published in the Journal of School Psychology was really looking at a comparison of this first stage of a consultative process, which we call the problem identification interview. This dates back to Bergen and Cradwell, 1990 behavioral consultation. It's been updated more since then. It's now considered more problem-solving consultation. And you can reference some of that through Frank and Cradwell's 2014 chapter on problem-solving consultation in the Urchel and Sheridan Handbook for School Consultation. And I have some of those references in the handout that's going to be available talking about teleconsultation in the process. So this was actually one part of my dissertation where for me, I was very frustrated, and many of you can maybe empathize with this. I would go to schools. I was in Southeast Louisiana. I would go to schools 45 minutes out from Baton Rouge, where I was doing my graduate work at Louisiana State University. And teachers or related service providers that I would meet with would forget that I was coming out. And when you get 45 minutes out, and this is probably applicable in other places too, it can get very remote very quickly, where there aren't as many places to go do work. There maybe isn't as many opportunities to find stable internet connections, maybe sometimes even at these schools. And I found that the frustration of just, having to essentially not have an hour and a half of my time be well used was frustrating. So during this time, this is around like 2010, I'm thinking, how do we make this more efficient? I was a graduate student. Being able to drive out 45 minutes was, a huge toll financially to get gas and be able to go back and forth. And so I wanted to figure out new ways. And so we worked with a variety of different teachers, 60 teachers, and we did this first interview, and we did it in person, and we did it through telehealth, and we wanted to compare how effective they were and acceptable they were. And this first one was looking really at the verbal interactions that we used within that. And what we found was that video conferencing or teleconsultation, this first interview, which we know is highly predictive of the larger success of consultation. If you can do a great job in that first interview, it can have really great effects. What we found was that video conferencing lended itself in 3 out of the 4 categories we were looking at to be a more effective, based on this metric we use called the consultation analysis record, a more effective based on these indices than our traditional in-person. We were able to be more efficient. We were able to dynamically go through topics. But what we found was we didn't spend too much time talking about any one topic. When we were in person, we spent more time talking about certain topics. And so where we continue to think about this and want to explore it, what we know is this is a viable way to effectively gather information about things that are happening with student behavior. Next from this, we really wanted to look at not just the teacher's experience and the effectiveness of gathering the information and doing the work we needed to do from that consultative standpoint. We also wanted to look at how does this help kids? Because at the end of the day, that's what consultation is all about. It's can we empower adults with new skills, make them feel more confident, more competent, but also to improve the outcomes of children. And there are 2 real big studies I want to highlight. One is from our colleagues, Brittany Bice-Urbach and Tom Cradwell, who are at the University of Wisconsin. And then myself and colleagues who did this work simultaneously, really looking at the effectiveness and acceptability of teleconsultation with students. In the Bice-Urbach and Cradwell study, these were looking at students in general education who had kind of your run-of-the-mill disruptive problem behaviors in the classroom. And then our study looked at students who had behavior problems, but also a student with autism spectrum disorder. And in this study, we switched the consultants. So my colleagues, Evan Dart and Keith Radley, who were at the time at the University of Southern Mississippi, and we've kind of flip-flopped as consultants. So we worked with students in their communities and they worked with students in our communities to really get that validity of the work we're doing. And we were very excited about showing that we could do this work and really improve teacher outcomes, and similar results for the Bice-Urbach and Cradwell study. When we think about moving forward, not only was it effective and acceptable in these kind of for the students and for the work we're doing, but was it acceptable to school psychologists who we feel largely would be doing this work in practice? They're very well positioned, as well as many other related service providers. But as a faculty in the school psychology program, this is really where a lot of my attention is always brought to. And we did a variety of studies. One was kind of like a market analysis. It's called a conjoint analysis study, where we're looking at these different pairs of scenarios and seeing what's sort of the breaking point about when people really would use teleconsultation and when they wouldn't. And what we found was that people would be likely to do it if the problem behavior was more mild, if the person they were working with was more familiar with this work, but particularly for the distance having to be traveled. And then the second study here on the bottom right is the second part of my dissertation, which really looked at the acceptability. And what we looked at was pre-experiencing any video conferencing or any other interviews. And then after experiencing these interviews, how do they rate video conferencing as a modality to collect this information? And what we found was, on average, the educators that participated said, yes, this is an acceptable way to do this on the front end, but after experiencing this technology, their scores significantly increased and they found it more acceptable, which really speaks so much to me because it says this is exposure. We need people to experience this work, this modality, and they become more comfortable, more fluent, and they start to feel the value, the benefits, because they can see it in their practice, because they can see efficiency increase, they can save on gas money, they can connect with families who maybe they weren't able to before. And so after answering some of these questions, we then started in 2018, we said, you know what, we need to put a special issue out in the Journal of Educational and Psychological Consultation, which we're super grateful to have the opportunity to work with them to do this, and have this special issue, which we talked about teleconsultation being really the new frontier of educational psychological practice in consultation. And in this special issue, which was co-edited by Bren Schultz and Bill Urchel and myself, we have a variety of articles that span everything from multidisciplinary teams for child mental health services in rural pediatrics to developing skills for school-based teams around functional behavior assessments, looking at applications broadly. It was a great review. And also the last two about teleconsultation to support education of students with visual impairments and families families who have children who are in the military, the families are in the military. And so looking at this kind of broad scope about how teleconsultation could be applied was really inspiring for me. And I encourage you all to check some of these out. After the special issue, we've also continued to look at other aspects because we said, you know, there's little nuanced questions like when I'm observing a student in person, which I traditionally would do as a related service provider or teacher, what is that like remotely or through video conferencing? And so we did a comparative study where we looked at momentary time sampling observations of students in classrooms, both in person and through video conferencing. And we compared that data. And what we found, we used the Bayesian statistic for this, is that there was no practical difference, which is how you would interpret this data, is that when actually doing this work, there was no discernible difference from the information we're gathering from our video conferencing observation to the work we're doing in person. And so this was important for me because moving into this model of teleconsultation, we're arguing, yes, you can do this. It is a great approximation of the work that you could do in person. Now, as you're thinking about this, you might say, yeah, that sounds great, but this can be a really dynamic experience. Kids move around a ton. And how do we make sure that we can maintain validity through that observation? Because I know for me, one of the big hangups was a kid would be working, and then they move off screen. We can't code that. What do we do? Well, that's not practical. And so I'm sitting and watching an episode of The Big Bang Theory, which hopefully many of you can empathize with me. It's one of my favorite shows. And there's an episode where Sheldon, and this is, pre-COVID, this was really, really very insightful for him, says, I don't need to go to work anymore. I can just build a telepresence robot and I can just go to work in that sense. And I started to think this is really interesting. And this is probably a way that we can address some of these issues. So I started to do my research. I found the double robot, which is shown here, and the Kubi robot, which is shown here. And these telepresence robots allow you to dynamically drive around an environment or look around an environment. Right now, I'm in my office on campus. I had to get special permission today to come on and do this, just so we get a stable internet connection. But in my office, I have a double robot. And during this time that COVID restrictions have been in place here in Utah, I've been able to log into my robot here in my office and drive around my office and look for things if I need to, or see if something's in my office to help a student who maybe needs something. It's been really, really helpful in that sense. But in the schools, these robots can be extremely helpful. I can drive around school environments. I can look around environments. I can be propped up on shelves in discrete ways. And so we find that these are really, really useful to dynamically interact in environments. And all of this work we've done in Washington County, which is in the southwest part of the state of Utah. It's about 3.5 hours if you're driving fast, about 4 hours from Salt Lake City. And it really allows us to dynamically support special education teachers, paraprofessionals, caregivers, and students in these classrooms from very far distances. We've worked with that district for about 4 years. It's been one of our favorite collaborations because it's informed so much of the work that we're talking about today, and so much of the research. So with our telepresence robot problem-solving consultation, TRPSC as we like to call it, we've worked with 5 school districts, 12 schools, 15 classrooms, over 75 teachers and paraprofessionals, and have helped support 200 students, many of which have autism spectrum disorder or other developmental disabilities, and are in more of our life skills classrooms or have just higher needs within schools. Very, very excitingly, we were able to publish 3 of these studies in the past few years. And just to give a shout out to the Society for the Study of School Psychology, who funded this research, particularly really early on for me as an early career scholar. And I'm very grateful for the support that they provided. This is a cool picture. This was at the Silicon Slopes Conference in Salt Lake City, Utah, which happened last year. It was probably like one of my last in-person memories of being in like a big conference space before COVID hit. And we were able to kind of show some of the cool work and the technology that we do. And these 3 publications highlighted that we could use these telepresence robots to help with increasing student compliance with teacher instructions. So this would be just following through with instructions, your kind of day-to-day, come sit down in this chair, time to clean up these toys. We are also able to use teleconsultation to teach expressive number discrimination through stimulus fading and reinforcement, and looking at conducting functional analyses of problem behavior through telehealth. I'll show you a clip of what some of that looked like in a little bit. But really looking at the error, the implementer error through this format. Like, do they make mistakes? Is it going to be profoundly detrimental? And so I'd encourage you to all check these out if interested. Now, more currently, the Journal of Behavior Education came out with a special issue in 2020. And we talk about like going full circle. This is another opportunity for me where I see things going full circle. Mandy Rispoli, who's at Purdue University, and Wendy McCulloch, who I mentioned before is at the University of Oregon, come out with this fantastic 2-volume special issue on advances in telehealth and behavior assessment and intervention in education, and this is just kind of a list here that I'll show you of some of the studies that are included. Really, really practical, really, really informative work. I would encourage you all to check it out. It's just so nice to see the many aspects of this work and more people doing it. Okay, so that's my quick run through of the history of teleconsultation, particularly around school-based work. Thanks for indulging me to go through that. I think that context really helps to let you all feel more confident that we do have research on this. There is continuously more research. This is a viable area to move when it comes to practice moving forward. And with that being said, I want to talk to you now about the practice model that I use and that I encourage you all to use when doing this work. So I mentioned before, problem-solving consultation is the overarching terminology. We've termed this problem-solving teleconsultation. This handout you see on the right side of your screen is available to you all. It'll be shared through the Google link that we have for all of the slides, for all the information that you need. And there's 5 really main steps that we'll talk about today. Rapport building, problem identification, problem analysis, treatment plan implementation, and problem evaluation. Let's jump right in. The first one is rapport building. This is the most important step to all of this. The reason this is the most important step is because all of the work that you do when you're trying to help a teacher, or if you're a teacher trying to help a parent, or if you're a related service provider trying to help a parent, however this works, you have to form a relationship with the other humans that you're interacting with. One of the biggest, most off-putting things is coming in guns blazing and saying that you know it all, or that you're totally disregarding the person, their human experience, the circumstances that they might have. This is increasingly more important now, considering COVID, considering the recent murders of people who are Black, considering the social outrage that we're seeing. These things are weighing heavily on people, and we have to be compassionate. We have to take time to build relationships with people so that they know that we care about them as humans. Because once people feel supported in that way, it really can do so much to moderate their ability to do all these other things. And so I really think this is important. I can't speak about it enough. And to do this, you have to establish trust and mutual respect. You do this by validating the people, the consultees, as the local expert. Those parents know those kids better than anyone else. You may know a lot about your domain, but their circumstances are unique. And we have to let them know that we recognize that. And then that we're not coming in as a person to boss them around, be an authoritarian, to tell about all the things they should do. No, we're saying we want to work side by side with you. We want to give you the knowledge, the skills that we have in the most approachable, digestible way, while you informing what we're doing. It's this reciprocal thing that's really critical. We also need to clarify roles, expectations, and responsibilities. This probably sounds really familiar to the students or the children you work with. In the beginning, we want to say, here's our classroom rules, or when we have this session, these are our few rules that we're going to be using. And really making sure that everything, to the extent possible, is known on the front end, particularly about who's going to do what and how we'll help each other. And it's okay if you can't think of everything. This takes a lot of time to get practiced and skilled, but if you forgot an expectation or you make a mistake, own it. Just say sorry. Take responsibility and accountability. That's going to build the rapport. And that really speaks to the point where rapport is a dynamic, ongoing process. You don't just build rapport, check the box, and then move on. You're going to have ongoing interactions, societal circumstances that you're going to have to acknowledge and validate and discuss, particularly to the extent it affects the consultative relationship. It's really, really important. The next part is using approachable language. And this is, a special shout out to my behavior analyst colleagues. I'm a behavior analyst, and one of the biggest things that I've continuously worked on is being able to differentiate my language based on the audience that I'm working with. If I'm geeking out with my behavior analyst friends and talking about motivating operations and talking about condition reinforcement and all the fun topics we could talk about, that's not going to be approachable to a parent. That's not going to be approachable to someone who is not indoctrinated in the same school of thinking and education that we've had. So being able to make really approachable language, I think, is really critical. And I believe that regardless of the field you come from, we can make it approachable. We can make it digestible. It just takes some thoughtful effort. We also need to talk about cultural diversity and comfort with technology. Many different cultures have adverse reactions to interacting with different technologies for whatever implications that they may bring historically to the cultural context. I think we have to be aware of that. I think we have to ask people about these things. I think we need to help make them feel comfortable about being recorded if they are recorded, or the fact that they may be able to see themselves on the screen. We have to talk about all these things that maybe make people feel uncomfortable. Asking questions is the best way to do these things. Not assuming being willing to learn and expand sort of how you conceptualize things can have just amazing outcomes to build a relationship. And then last but not least is gaining consensus. We have to make sure we're on the same page for the work we're doing. If we are not on the same page, we are going to have divergent ideas about how outcomes will happen. You may get frustrated as the consultant, the consultee may get frustrated, and so gaining consensus and checking in about that is critical. Okay, so we've only discussed step one up to this point, and it feels like a lot, but you're going to be spending time in this phase and ongoing through this phase. It's threaded throughout. Make sure that you're purposefully looking at this, and if you feel rapport start to diminish, or you feel the connection that you have with this person is diminishing, they're not communicating as much, make overt efforts to try to make that rapport better. Be empathic, be compassionate. Those things can go a really long way. All right, so let's jump in now to some of the details about how we actually execute this problem-solving teleconsultation model beyond the relationship building. This step, the problem identification, this is where we're defining whatever the problem may be, and really the outcome we want, the kind of replacement behavior in a clear, observable terminology. And this is so important. We have to be able to measure these things that we want to change. We can't rely exclusively on people's feelings about these things or their subjective impressions. Of course, qualitative information is important. Social validity is important. User experience is important. But when we're looking at behavior change, which at the end of the day in schools is critical, whether it be reading proficiency or on-task behavior or engaging in social emotional skills, we have to be able to know when these things happen. The best way to do that is to define it. So we spend a lot of time talking about what is the problem and what do you want to see in place of that in the clearest, most measurable way. We also want to look at the contextual factors influencing and maintaining the problem. Context is everything. I think it's becoming increasingly more important that we're looking and asking questions about things like, does the student sleep? Is there a certain class that this is happening in more than others? When certain students are around, does this change how these things happen? Is there a consistent trigger that happens every single time that sets off the student to engage in these problem behaviors? Or are there certain triggers that happen that promote positive behaviors? And then of course, how do we respond? What happens when we see a problem or something desirable that we want in the environment? What do we do about those things? Do we ignore? Do we give a lot of attention? Do we provide praise? These are great questions that you should be asking. And then from this, you want to set measurable goals from those definitions with the consultee. So the parent or educator, you want to say, I'm hearing that this is a problem in your class, and I hear that you want to increase this instead. I'm wondering if we can try to get a 50% increase in this desired behavior in the next 3 to 4 weeks. Does that seem pretty reasonable to you? Or it may look like, oh, I just need to get this student to stay in their seat. Totally reasonable. What can we do to help promote in a socially valid way the student staying in their seat? Oh, well, really, I just need them to sit in their seat for like 2 minutes, because if I ever need to go run and do something, I can say to them, go sit in your seat for 2 minutes, here, read this book, or do this activity, and I'll be back. Now, we might have to build up to that, but that is a clear goal that we can try to work towards using our database decision-making. And then it comes to developing a plan for baseline data collection. You want to empower the caregiver or the educator, whoever you're working with, to say, start collecting some of this data. I want to know how long they can stay in their seat. I want to know how often they get out of their seat. I want to know how many times during class that there's vocal stereotypy, which is when a student would be engaging in maybe nonsensical or non-connected language, the activity. Or I want to know just a frequency count across the day of how many times a student's eloping from the classroom, running out of the classroom. So we think about all these things, we start to orient our idea to what is really the problem and how we want to change those things, and we collect that data. While this data is being collected, we move to our next phase, which is the problem analysis phase. And this is where we're doing all of our research. This is when we get to be the detectives and figure out what is going on with these problems. What is the underlying reason? So we look at review of records, we look at teacher observation. So what are the adults doing in the classroom? What are adults doing at home if we're looking at home? We also look at students, and we compare those to see if interventions are being implemented, if there are contraindicated interventions or interventions that maybe make things worse happening in the environment. We also look at ABC data collection, which is the antecedent behavior consequence tracking, where we start to note the frequency and reoccurrence of certain triggers, of certain behaviors, and then the consequence or how we respond to those behaviors. We're looking at functional behavior assessment data, or maybe during this time, we're implementing, conducting our own. And we're looking at things that can inform our interventions, all the context. This is the context gathering place that I really spend most of my time. We also want to look at the acceptability of interventions once we've decided those. And we do this by talking to the teachers. So we take all this information, we say, here's what we have, here's the ideas about what interventions we think would be helpful. What do you think about implementing that with this student? It's a great place to start. And whoever you're working with as a consultee might say, I'm out, that's too much. You say, okay, well, here's another option. Or they might say, I don't know, this seems like both could be good. Okay, cool. Let's figure out which one works best for you. And we can look to other great school psychology researchers. My colleague who published some of our telehealth work, Evan Dart, he has some great work around test driving interventions. And I think this is a great way for teachers to do some time limited, to kind of get the feel. You know, before you buy a car, you say, yeah, I'm going to drive it around, see what it's like. Before you commit to an intervention, it may be helpful to test drive some of those and see if it's sustainable for your classroom. And then, of course, at this phase, talking about the implementation barriers that may exist from this potential intervention that we've selected. So we select an intervention with this teacher, we figure out the barriers, we say, give me a few days or however long you need. I'm going to write up this intervention in a behavior intervention plan. We're going to meet again, and we're going to talk about implementing this plan. And this gets us to the plan implementation phase. We have our written procedures. We meet with the teacher or other consultee, and we go through and teach the procedures using what's called a behavioral skills training model. Behavioral skills training is like best practice instruction for anyone. For teachers or educators who are on the call, I do, we do, you do. That's the comparable way you probably were learning about it in your teacher prep programming. And for the behavioral skills training discussion, it's tell, show, do. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of those phases in a second. We collect data and monitor progress during this time that we're training or that the intervention is being implemented. We have to be available on the first day of implementation. This is so important. Don't leave people hanging on the first day they have to do something new. It does not set them up for success. Be there to be a resource. Be there to help support them, to give them feedback. The performance feedback piece of this is critical. I don't know about you all, but for me and for the students that I have the privilege of working with, we are very open to the idea of accepting feedback and giving each other feedback in a collaborative, constructive way. It's how we grow the most as people across whatever domain we're looking at. But when it comes to implementing these services with students, we have to be able to make sure we're aligning our procedures as quickly as possible so that we can maximize outcomes for students. So performance feedback and ongoing performance feedback is critical. And it speaks to the need for us as adults to be open to coaching and consultation around topics as long as people are treating us with dignity and respect. I think past experiences can couch some of this and make it more challenging. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but performance feedback is critical and I think very formative in our practice. Okay, so let's discuss a little bit about behavioral skills training. Step one I mentioned was tell. So in this phase, I have my behavior intervention plan, I have whatever plan is that I'm trying to make change with, and I say, here are all the steps. I'm going to talk you through these interventions. You may have questions, we'll talk through those things. So it's very reciprocal, but it's not very interactive. It's not as dynamic as it could be. The next thing we do is show. And in an in-person consultation format, this is fairly easy. I can jump up in front of the classroom, I can work individually with the student and model some of this work for them. And I think that's really powerful. But what we found through telehealth and teleconsultation is this is where it becomes a little bit more challenging. This is where if I'm on the screen here, like you're seeing me, and I'm trying to model an intervention, it can get kind of clumsy really quick. So what we've been working on trying to do is create more accessible modeling strategies for parents, for educators, for administrators, for anyone trying to learn evidence-based practices. And so if you take out your phone right now and you open up your camera and you scan any of the QR codes for your favorite social media application, you'll be able to see a variety of videos that we have. I think we've posted over 140 videos that are about 30 seconds in length or a minute in length. And these cover topics about behavioral principles, academics, schedule and routine, tackling boredom, electronic safety, social emotional learning and wellness, positive reinforcement. And currently we have these 4 languages listed, as well as Korean, and we plan on adding Arabic and French by the end of summer to all of our content. And this is really important for us because we really believe in the inclusive work that we're trying to do in schools. And to do that, we have to recognize that many students, many families don't speak English, and that we need to be able to engage them in their predominant language spoken at home, so that everyone can have access to these really important evidence-based practices. So let me show you a little bit about what this would look like. This is just our Facebook page, but what we're really excited about is not only are in different languages, but we're able to make sure that we're inclusive in the content, so that the characters that are shown in these are representative of the students and the families that we work with here in Salt Lake City. This is our Twitter account. You can see so our intro video here. And the impetus for this was when we changed from in-person services to more remote after COVID restrictions went into place. Our partnership with the Grant School District, we committed to making these as tools that everyone could use. And these are free online. This is our YouTube channel. Feel free to integrate these videos in your own training, use them as tools, share with everyone you can, like our pages. It's a really great resource. And so I really encourage that. So again, this would be the teaching and modeling phases. All right. The next step, step 3, is the do phase. And this is the rehearsal and performance feedback. And this for me is really where the magic happens. And I mentioned this before. And we can do this through store and forward video review. This would be asynchronous. Someone might be practicing with like a teacher or a paraprofessional might be practicing, and they recorded them doing some type of work, or they might be recording it with a student, and you send it through the secure folder. And then as the supervisor or consultant, I can look at this content. I can view it, provide performance feedback in a written or video recorded format. We also can do this live telecoaching sessions where I might be watching and they're doing work, and they come over at the end and we debrief, say, okay, I really like how you were providing a ton of positive reinforcement. You were also differentially ignoring any of those kind of low-level problem behaviors that we didn't really want to pay attention to. And then last is this idea of bug and ear coaching, which I love. And I'll show you a video clip of what this looks like. But this is in real-time live telecoaching for people who are very comfortable with immediate performance feedback. I think you want to assess kind of where people are at. Some people find it like super overwhelming to have someone talking to them in their ear. And then there's some people who are very comfortable. Just tell me what I need to do in the moment. And so again, you're trying to provide constructive feedback as well as positive reinforcement, praise for the fantastic work they're doing. So for this next slide, this is a kind of user view of a functional analysis that we conducted. A functional analysis would be an assessment for problematic behavior that we did in a school. This was a few years ago. And it shows you the paraprofessional in this video who we trained through this tell, show, do model, who has a bug in the ear on the far side that you can't see. And you'll hear my language on top of it, coaching and providing feedback. We blocked off just the view of the student just to protect privacy, but you'll be able to hear everything that's going on. There's a little bit of yelling and some foul language, which is kind of part of working with students in schools. And so I just want to give you all the heads up for that one. And this again is the interface through Kubi, the Kubi robot that we have.
You're doing great, Patina. Just keep ignoring her.
Sorry, everyone.
Okay, ask her to do her work again.
Double playing. So let me just wait for this one to end, and then I'll go back again.
So never mind, you don't have to. Great job, Patina. You're doing awesome.
It is stupid work.
Self-deprecation. Yeah, escape academic. Count on those. Instruct her to do her work again. She said no, you can take it over. You said never mind, you don't have to.
It's not giving it to me.
But hopefully you got some of the context of that. You could hear me maybe more times than you needed to talk through that, but it's a really nice way to give some of that dynamic feedback. Okay, so that moves on to our next step, which is step 5, which is the problem evaluation.
You're doing great, Patina.
Oops. Sorry about that. And everyone can hear okay, doing okay? Okay, awesome. This next step, which is the problem evaluation phase, is how are things going? You've done all this work, you coach them, you're implementing all that, they're collecting data. We need to be able to ask questions like, was the intervention implemented as planned? If it was, you should commend performance. Great job for all of the folks who are doing this work. If not, we need to figure out how we can support any barriers. And really how we do this is thinking, did the problem get better? If the problem did get better, yes, then we need a plan to maintain and generalize the skills. We work with the teachers. How can we fade out some of our consultative supports? Because again, as a consultant, we're trying to work ourselves out of a job. We are empowering the local experts to do what they do and get out of their way once we feel like they can do a great job, of course, with support as needed. If not, if the problem's not getting better, it could be due to poor implementation of the interventions. And that's where we need to provide additional support to the consultee. If it's due to a lack of effectiveness, then we want to go back to step 3, that problem analysis phase, and figure out different interventions that we might use to help support this. So this for me is a really kind of nice way to conceptualize all this work. It's all informed by data, but really importantly, we have to be able to monitor progress and know when we need to take steps back and know when we need to maintain and generalize. Okay. What are some of the factors predicting consultation success and through this model? The consultant competence and experience is a huge one, to the extent that you as the consultant know what you're doing, know how to interact, know how to build a relationship, to have the technical skills to do it. That's going to really drive a lot of these outcomes. Technical knowledge is great. We need to have it. We need to kind of do it with finesse, and we need to have it without making people feel bad and without being arrogant. Prior consultation is also a predictor. Unfortunately, many individuals that I consult with haven't always had the best consultative experiences. And because of that, I think it can be problematic about how they generalize those experiences on you as a consultant. But we have to be empathic. Like we can't take that personally. We have to disrupt that by our own actions. We have to say, yeah, we validate that you have had this past experience, but we want to show that it can be different. Will you give me a chance? And I think most people are reasonable and will do that and won't hold other people's missteps against you unless systemically and frequently they've happened. And then we have to really have conversations about these things. Also, it's the ability to perform in an environment with lack of control and flexibility. For all the school providers, I know you can totally empathize with me. There are little to no things that you can actually have control over in these environments that you can reliably predict. Many of it is just so dynamic. And that's how school-based consultation really differs from consultation or just services in general in clinical settings, where maybe you have a little bit tighter control of the environment, the people who interact, the work they do. And so the mindset of saying, I have to roll with a lot of this, I have to lean into resistance, that's going to be really, really helpful. The next one is factors predicting consultation success is looking at interpersonal skills and consultant management skills. The interpersonal skills, and I talked a lot about this, I mean, are huge. They're so important. The language we use, we talk a lot about that. But also conflict resolution skills. A lot of times when changing adult behavior, it can feel tough. You may have people who are disgruntled. You have people who are frustrated, particularly working in circumstances that may be hard at home or in school. And so being able to resolve some of that conflict is really, really important. And I think that's probably requires a lot of professional development because not everyone is just really great at navigating tough situations. And I think about the nuance of how I've learned to try to be more sophisticated in those ways through my career. And it takes reflection. It takes real work to figure out how you can navigate tough situations with people. Also is this idea of mastery of social influence. And social influence is really important kind of social psychology concept where we can use different kind of tools to help people do things that would be beneficial in our society. And of course, in thinking about our ethical codes, things that we hope are good, that improve kind of the level of reinforcement and minimize punishment. And one of the big social influence domains that I like to use a lot is this idea of referent power. Referent power is this social influence tool that says, if it worked for this other person, and I know that person, I think it could work for me too. And so a lot of times when we're doing consultation, we're talking to teachers, we're talking to parents about similar parents we've worked with and how those experiences have worked, or lessons learned. We talk to teachers, or what's really, really powerful is if you can get a teacher or another parent or someone to have conversations with other stakeholders and let them say, hey, I've worked with this person. They're really helpful. They helped me understand these new things. They made me feel really comfortable. They're great. And that's how you can really have a really amazing social influence with people you work with. And of course, this idea of rapport, which we talked a ton about. The next piece is consultant management skills. And for this one, it's maintaining a consultation schedule. And I think this is so critical because whether it be pre-COVID, post-COVID, or while we're still in this kind of COVID pandemic right now, people have a lot going on. And I think the reliability of us as consultants can be really important. We have to be forgiving of our consultees when they say, I'm sorry, I had to do childcare for a bit right now, and I just didn't have the time to do that. Hey, no problem, we'll reschedule. But to the extent that you can be reliable and predictable for your consultees, they are gonna see that as a positive. They're gonna respect that. And remember, don't take any of these things personal. One of the things I think is super important is just being able to roll with all of the difficulty that comes up. So the schedule is a great way of maintaining those things. And then of course, documentation and record keeping. This is very critical during this time. There's so many unknowns about services for students, particularly students with ASD or other disabilities in schools. Document all of your interactions. There's not enough documentation that you can do to make sure that you know everything that happened. It also gives credit to the work you've done during this time where it's maybe not visible because people can't just walk into school and see you working with a family or a teacher. Let's talk a little bit about the applications of teleconsultation that we've seen with caregivers and educators. And there's a variety of supports: academic, behavior, social emotional learning, well-being. You can work with caregivers around a lot of these things, feeding and sleep and hygiene. These are all great areas that I would really encourage you all to use teleconsultation. And then in the education space, behavior management, online teaching and online pedagogy, social emotional learning, well-being, caregiver engagement. I really encourage educators to use this to empower parents. And then of course, just like helping students in general with their engagement. So you'll see another poll popped up. This one say, would parents you work with be interested in teleconsultation supports? I'd love to hear what you all think. And with the last about 10 minutes that I have before we open it up for questions, I want to talk a little bit about kind of a home-based application that really highlights some of our feeding work using telehealth, which has been a kind of a big area that we've done in the past 4 or 5 years. So when we look at feeding concerns, and many of you can probably empathize with this, when it comes to the population of students with autism spectrum disorder, we're talking about 80 to 90% of students have some type of feeding concern. And thanks for those who responded to the poll. We see like 87 response, or 91% would be interested. That's fantastic. That makes me feel really happy that y'all are interested still after hearing me talk about this stuff for a little bit over an hour now. So when we talk about feeding concerns, I mean, the ones that we're really looking at and that we treat in our feeding clinic is food selectivity and food refusal. We're not talking about some of the more acute feeding problems that you may have to go to specialized centers for, tube feeding and kind of failure to thrive. We're talking more about your run-of-the-mill feeding problems that we know many students with autism spectrum disorder have. And if you have also children you work with or at the home who don't have autism, we know it's about 25% of the general population. And so here in Utah, we have a little bit larger family sizes, about 5 children per family. Guaranteed 1 child in that family you're making a special individualized meal for. And we really want to try to address some of those things to just help in general. We'll see another poll pop up. Do you work with students with feeding problems? I'd love to hear what that looks like for you all. So let me talk a little bit about some of the work we do. I'm going to go through this relatively briefly, and we'll end on like a video so that you can see a little bit of this work. And it looks like about half of you work with students with feeding problems. Thanks for responding. We are always using positive behavior strategies. We're trying to shape behavior. We're trying to increase positive behavior because feeding is a lifelong skill. We don't want to use aversive strategies. We don't want to use some of these more escape extinction-based strategies for the behavior analytic folks that look at like non-removal of a spoon, which can just be really unethical for families. They don't have as much buy-in. It can be really aversive. And so we're trying to build sustainable lifelong behaviors. This takes some time, but we have a lot of time because feeding is going to happen for a very long time in these people's lives. So we're really trying to shape self-feeding and consumption. The study I'm about to show you, this was one we did in-person work, or I'm sorry, this was a teleconsultation project where we looked at food selectivity in children with avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, which would be the DSM diagnosis for this kind of picky eating. This on the right, you'll see kind of the different phases that we go through: touching, holding, kissing, licking, bite, putting in the mouth, and then consuming. Putting in the mouth would be able to kind of spit it out after chewing it for a little bit. Here is the data from that study. This is just one of the panels, which really shows we use the changing criteria design, which changed the schedule of reinforcement. In the very beginning, in that first column, there was a fixed ratio. So every time they would take a bite of the non-preferred or engage in some of the approximative behaviors, they would be able to access reinforcement. And we were able to change this going up. This right here is a variety of different foods: raspberries, strawberries, and oranges. We're really only looking at consumption at this phase. And this is the bites consumed. At follow-up, we were able to maintain 10 bites, which for us is kind of like our portion of food that we're looking for. So we have some real promise working with parents to do this work. The next article that came out around this was developing a telehealth feeding clinic and how folks might be able to do some of this work. And shout out to Rachel Clark, Erica Lehman, and Brad Bloomfield, who were amazing collaborators on this early feeding clinic work and getting this stuff set up. In a little bit, I'll show you a video of Dr. Bradley Bloomfield, who's just leaving the University of Alabama and heading over to Monash University in Australia. And so really in our clinic, we're looking at interdisciplinary assessment through store and forward means where people are recording videos before they come into the clinic. We have live video conferencing to do some of our interdisciplinary assessment with speech and language pathologists, occupational therapists, psychologists, and nutritionists, and then of course providing interventions so that we can generalize these skills into the home from the get-go where these meals are happening. We find, yeah, you can bring people into clinics, the environment, it's so hard to recreate what's really happening in the real world. Let's just start there. Let's build for large gains right out the gate. Okay, so let's try this next video. I'll move to this slide. Maybe Valeska, if you don't mind pushing play for me, then I won't mess it up this time.
No, just a broccoli. And then if you want, you can eat more noodles.
I can't after I eat my broccoli.
You have noodles all over your plate. You can eat as many of the noodles as you want.
So this is a store and forward video that the family sent of this one child who had some food difficulty. And you can see on just the affect how hard this is for this child.
Don't throw it. It's already down.
And then we move into our telehealth intervention phases.
Sorry.
No worries.
Okay. All right. So, Alex, which one would you like to try first?
Orange juice.
Orange juice. Okay. 2 goats.
And at this part, we moved past the chafing procedures. We're already at consumption.
Great job. That was very
trying to
fast.
get this child to consume more.
Okay. You get a grape. And what do you want to pick? That was in.
And then moving into our later phases of teleconsultation.
What do you want to do?
How about orange?
Okay. Oranges again.
God, cold. I can't.
Good.
You already had your 2 bites of orange?
Mm-hmm.
That was so quick.
Good.
7.
Excellent. Let me move forward here to our next slide. So really what we're looking at, and that's kind of a video of some of the work, we're really looking at if we can improve some of those outcomes. And for the sake of time, you have these in their slides, but this is just a little bit more of the data that we have. And this is a separate study, but really showing kind of in depth. This was our baseline phase where we were not really seeing much frequency of behavior. I'm kind of breaking these down for you all. And then we move to our intervention phases. And in intervention, you can see that we're really trying to be meticulous about going through each of the phases. So at each of the different levels, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, they correspond to different panels. Let me zoom in for you so you can see this a little bit better based on different foods. We were able to systematically go through and demonstrate we can increase every level of approximation and then get to increasing bites consumed. We were able to do that for our dried pineapple, banana chip. Again, this was different from the video you just saw, dried apricot, dried apple, and a sandwich. And so we weren't able to get to 10 just because of the length of the duration of the study, but we have some great outcomes showing that through telehealth, you can modify these behaviors, you can shape these behaviors. Okay, so that puts us right at about at 10:30, and or 10:30 my time, which would be closer for you guys to 12:30. What did we learn today? Teleconsultation has a rapidly growing body of research to support its use. It can be used for a variety of school-based work, as well as these pediatric psychology applications, especially around food and feeding, which I think are just really critical. We know the impact. The use of problem-solving model is really important. We also talked about building genuine relationships through this model and how important that was and what you can do. Tomorrow, we'll talk more about the nitty-gritty technical details about how do you actually get some of the engagement pieces, how do you promote the relationship. And then I want to leave you with just for today is just to be brave to use teleconsultation in your work. This is increasingly more important. And as we continue the need to provide these services as we move forward, I would encourage you all to just jump in. And so with that, I want to leave you on this last slide before we open up with questions. This is the book that's shown on this slide is the most recent book in 2019 that myself, Ty Collins, Evan Dart, and Keith Radley edited around technology applications in school consultation, supervision, and school psychology training. Our publisher, Routledge, was kind enough to provide the first chapter on teleconsultation, which is a broad practical review and has some great applied kind of nuggets in there. Take out your phones again, open your camera, scan that QR code. It's going to bring you right to the website that'll give you that chapter. And I encourage you to read it in the time that you may have. Also, if you're interested in checking out some of the work that we do in our lab, please go to our lab website or follow us on Twitter. We're always releasing these resources, trying to show all the amazing work that our fantastic lab members are doing. And we encourage you to join us kind of on our journey of doing all this work in schools. With that, I wanted to thank you all for joining me on day one. I'm excited to see you all again tomorrow, and let's open it up now for questions.
Okay, hi there. So I'm going to try to go through the question and answer and see, consolidate some of the questions into kind of general topics. So there were quite a few questions initially, Aaron, about the different platforms that folks might use for teleconsultation and your thoughts about the pros and cons of some of them, what you know about the pros and cons of some of them, particularly Zoom and Zoom Pro and Microsoft Teams versus Adobe Connect, which some folks have indicated is a bit problematic for them because of the Flash component to it, etc. So maybe you could speak a little bit about your experience using different platforms for different types of purposes.
Absolutely, yeah. What a great question. And I'll start answering this question by saying we use Zoom. We use a HIPAA FERPA compliant version of Zoom that we have to pay extra for, the same that you might if you're like a hospital provider. And so it's a licensed version of Zoom. I think the most important thing when using this technology is making sure that you're using a HIPAA and FERPA compliant software. And tomorrow we'll talk more about like what makes it HIPAA, FERPA compliant. What do you need to ensure is in place? Some of the big ones that I've seen our local schools use is Microsoft Teams. I've seen people use Google. I've seen them use Zoom. Those are the three big ones, at least locally and nationally, that I think are being used most in schools. And the important thing is that schools are signing an agreement, which we'll talk about tomorrow, that ensures that student data is being protected. And that's really critical. And we've been using the licensed version of Zoom for years. And it's been extremely helpful because as this pandemic started, some of our local districts said, you can't use Zoom. The good thing was we had the licensed version of Zoom. What they're really saying is you can't use Zoom because it's not at this level of security, which comes at a cost. And I think it was admirable for companies like Zoom to say, hey, we're going to try to make this encrypted stuff accessible to all folks early on. But we saw the issue with that. We saw Zoom bombing. We saw a ton of just really problematic security issues that arose. Good news is Zoom and other platforms continuously update that. They've been responsive and they're able to sort of protect these things moving forward. So I'd say, as you're thinking of a platform, some of you may be kind of pushed into using one because your district says to do it. But if you have the luxury of purchasing your own, or you can have like a group of folks who come together, because I know that with the Zoom license account, there's like a minimum requirement. That might be ways to have robust software that really ensures the security. So I really appreciate that question. I love that y'all are thinking about that. And I imagine as time goes on, we'll have new software, we'll have new features, but the underlying piece of all this is safety, security, privacy. Can we ensure those things?
Awesome. Thanks so much for that answer. Okay, so we have another question or set of questions that really rely on maybe whether there are some templates that you have developed that you found to be useful for recording baseline data through a virtual format, or how you might go about creating something that would be useful for that.
I love this question too. This is awesome. And we'll spend some time, particularly tomorrow, diving into some of the software, some of the tools you can use. We're super privileged in our lab. I hire a computer scientist who's on our staff who develops web-based apps, web-based tools on very approachable software like Google Sheets or Excel to make it really available. So we have some of those digitally available ones, and I'll show you some examples. If you're interested, I'd encourage you to shoot me an email. And also check out our lab website. We try to keep all those resources online for free for everyone. We don't really try to have a proprietary piece to this because I think the more people who can collect good data, the better decisions we can make for our students. So if you have the computer science know-how, which I unfortunately aspire to, if I ever get a sabbatical, I'm gonna learn how to code and I'm gonna learn how to do a bunch of this work myself. I think it'd be a great place to allocate your efforts to try to create tools that are unique and individualized for the people that you work with. Because what I found is some of the commercially available tools aren't always as nuanced as we'd like. So yes, I'm happy to share. Please feel free to shoot me an email for that or other items that are of interest. And if we have kind of a good base of folks who want similar items, I'm happy to share them on the Google folder that we have for this webinar.
Wonderful. And I will be following up with participants on how to access that Google folder, or you can just send me an email as well. If you would rather just have a PDF of the slides emailed to you, I can do that as well. We have another question here about kind of the first steps on getting a school district perhaps to feel comfortable and open to the idea of teleconsultation, particularly pre-COVID. How did that process work? Because there is often district kind of reluctance to use technology in the classroom, particularly by outside consultants. So your experiences there would be really valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate that question. And I understood the district sort of apprehension, and I can give you sort of some of the historical context for how that started for me, and just some kind of tidbits of useful information I think would work. So I emailed every special ed director across the state of Utah when I first came here. And I said, hey, I'm interested in doing teleconsultation work with some of your special education teachers and paraprofessionals to improve outcomes for students. Would you be interested in doing this? This is a free service. We wanted to do it for research. I only had one school district be interested, and I'm super grateful for that district. This is Washington County, who we still work with. And it really spoke to, I think, the desire to improve outcomes, particularly in these remote and underserved areas. And so one of the big hangups and some of the conversations in the beginning was, how do we keep this safe and secure? How do we make sure that not everyone's information is being shared? And the really cool thing about teleconsultation, when it happens in a synchronous format, which is really largely how we do this work, it's live, it's not recorded. And it is essentially a proxy for us being there in person, because at the end of the call, there's nothing stored. There's nothing saved. There's no way for us to go back to look at any of those interactions. And so what we end up doing is, in the classrooms that we serve students, we inform all the parents that they're receiving this teleconsultation supports, and that we Zoom in remotely. Nothing's being recorded, and that we are able to kind of interact with the students in the same way we were there. And that was really the big piece. As long as we weren't recording anything, we were able to fall in line with the FERPA and HIPAA standards. Now, there were times before COVID that we did need to record, like the videos you saw. And in those cases, the district was comfortable with us recording, as long, same as it would be in person, that we had consent from every child who was recorded from their parents. And so if we couldn't get a child's parents to consent to the recording, we would have to make sure that we provided equitable modifications so that students could receive education in a different space, or that we would take the students who we were trying to work with to a different space to make sure that we weren't disrupting the school day too much. And so there are always practical barriers, ethical barriers to consider. But I think that the districts that we've worked with, and since then, it's moved on to other districts. One of my proudest kind of moments was one of the BCBA supervisees I had, who worked in a local school district here. She's a special education coordinator. She bought like 15 Kubis, and she has them distributed all across her special education classroom so she can just Zoom in. This was all pre-COVID. And so it was really promising to me to see that it wasn't just me trying to do these things and districts seeing the utility, but they're real practical examples of this. And I think, like we talked about referent power, when school district A is doing this and we've kind of figured these things out, and the other districts say, yeah, we want to do that too, and that looks good too. We're really lucky here in Utah. We have some of the largest districts across the Wasatch Front, which is the mountain range that's right next to the city. We have all the special ed directors come together, and there's a lot of sharing of information, a lot of collaboration to promote some of these things. And so I'm hopeful afterwards more schools, not only in Utah, but across the country, are open to this work and make decisions that are informed by good information, by good evidence, and not just being worried about of things that could happen, but knowing that we can keep things safe and secure in this teleconsultative format.
Okay, so there's a couple of kind of comments that are sort of questions that I'm going to try to put in a format that makes this most sense. One is about kind of the rapport building process virtually, which is very different than live interactions. And then another question that's sort of related to that is, how do you kind of maintain attention and engagement virtually, particularly for some children who really aren't as used to using technology, or who have very limited attention spans, kind of how to get them to sit and engage and submit work or do the tasks that are being asked of them. And I know this is a challenge many of our educators encountered kind of during COVID instructional time, because there are varying degrees of success in getting children to engage in that format.
Yes, absolutely. Let me answer the second one first, and then we can go back to the first one. Engagement is like the #1 issue. Connectedness, attention, these are all really, really critical things to make in-person education happen, but also remote education happen. And what I find is we're talking about similar things. We just have to understand that for our students, this is a new context. This is a new environment, and saw these same issues in the classroom before. We would expect these same issues in the home setting. But what can we do to make modifications? What can we do to be evidence-based and provide practices that are evidence-based, provide database decision-making, and think about what are reasonable goals at home? Well, we need to get a child to engage maybe at most, I would say, for the secondary students I work with who are on the spectrum, 30 minutes is like the sweet spot. For my adult learners here on campus, the graduate students I work with, 30 minutes is the max. So I think we have to also realize there are some reasonable modifications, and that we're probably going to have to individualize that for some of the students we work with. And it's about getting a baseline of where they're at. They might be able to come on and engage with you for 2 minutes. Cool, let's start there. We have a long time to get through all these things. We're gonna have a whole nother school year. And our goal should be about gradually increasing that time. How do we do these things? I'll talk a lot about it tomorrow. It's channeling your inner YouTube star. Some of the best pedagogy I've seen during this time are people who were comfortable being weird and being funny and engaging to these students who maybe need something that is a little bit more exciting. Now, again, we have to differentiate our instruction. So for some kids that might work, and for some kids, us acting that way could be really aversive. And so we have to really know our students. If the first time you're getting to know them is through telehealth in this format, I would really encourage you to include the parents. I would encourage you to have them help, let you know what are the little nuances, what are the preferred interests. And then with some of the tools I'll talk about tomorrow is getting this engagement to be just more than you and the student with maybe like handheld stuff. Get them to engage with the computer, get them to engage within this format so that they are more directed to the keys, to the mouse, to having to respond the same ways I asked you all to do polls. It's hard work. It's hard work in the same way it's hard work in school, where you're trying to have readiness and you're trying to have engagement. And those can be largely influenced by circumstances. And I would say just in general during this time, expect it to be difficult, expect it to be hard, but don't let that discourage you. I know we've seen with some of the work we've done, particularly in the spring, we were able to get group therapy, social emotional therapy going and getting really high levels of engagement from our students because we were starting to capitalize, at least in the group format, peers interacting with each other. Hey, you asked this other student to do something. Because at the end of the day, that was a really reinforcing opportunity. And again, these were students who were higher functioning. These were students who were able to benefit from some of the online social interaction. For students who maybe aren't as engaged, it's about thinking of creative and new pedagogical tools. Your educators who you work with, or if you are educators, you all are very well positioned because you probably know some of this. And if not, your ed tech departments are a wealth of knowledge to help inform some of these practices. And then I'm not sure, Jen, if I answered the first question. Feel free to repeat the other part of it if not.
Yeah, so the other part was kind of how do you not just get students engaged, but how do you start from scratch on kind of gaining rapport through a teleconsultation model when you're not kind of live there in front of the student, kind of controlling the materials and activities directly.
I appreciate that. For me, it's always finding out what the child likes, and I'm sharing my screen and I'm trying to pull up a bunch of images or videos because I'm wanting them to have a fun time. I may not have toys that I can play with per se. And, some people may have issue with, well, there's so much technology and we're viewing all this. During this time, this is a viable option. Are there issues with too much screen time? Yes. Are we all experiencing too much screen time right now? Yeah, of course. This is like how we're interacting through all of this. So I would encourage you to recognize those things, but also say, these are going to be powerful tools for me to bring it up on the screen and show some videos and laugh and have that shared experience. And to pair ourselves with these positive experiences that are happening gradually. And then once they realize, hey, these are fun things, I get to watch videos here. Maybe I get to play a fun game on a digital whiteboard, which we'll talk about tomorrow. Now I can start to use these rewards contingently throughout the session. So I need you to work with me and talk to me for maybe a couple minutes, and you can run around and play for a little bit. Then you can come back, we can watch your video, however you want to do it. But I think that these strategies can look very similar to how they would in person, but it's about being creative with the online tools that we have. And again, tomorrow we'll spend a lot of time really going through the applications and the use of many of the tools integrated in video conferencing software and freely available online.
Okay, the final question relates to your robots. I think a few people were pretty intrigued by kind of the robots and how they're used, and you know, how those are funded and how many schools are using them, and how many per school, and those kind of particulars.
Great, those are all great questions. So this technology, the telepresence robots, the Kubi robot, which was the smaller tabletop version, those are about $700. The nice thing about the robot is it interfaces with any tablet or cell phone and can use any video conferencing stream. Essentially, you have the video conferencing stream on your device, and then the robot is controlled by a web page that you pull up separately and you move it around. It has like a grid, and you can point on where the grid, and it looks around kind of in that space. It's super cool. You can save different locations. So that one tends to be our more approachable, mass kind of pushed out telepresence robot. We have about 10 of those. Our double robots, those are the drivable ones. Those we use when we have more school-wide applications, or we have students who maybe are more, who are included more with their general education peers, and we need to be able to drive to maybe a general education classroom, we need to drive back to a resource classroom. We are really trying to be able to support in that dynamic way. Those robots are far more expensive. Those are $3,500 each. But the nice thing is it's kind of a one-stop package that has all of everything integrated, including the software. And we really like the support that both companies have provided, but there's just kind of different uses for them. To fund these, we've relied on grants, which we've received from different organizations, as well as the University of Utah with some of the kind of early grants that I had here. And then also just the school districts, having them lease some of the products from us. So we have them essentially pay like leasing fees so that we can maintain the technology and purchase new ones if we need to. So that's been very, very helpful. If you think about the $3,500 for the more expensive one, or even $700, it may initially feel like a lot. If you're using this frequently, if you're already a provider who's traveling from different schools, maybe you're accruing mileage, the time saved, the gas money that's saved, the wear and tear on your car, it can pay for itself very quickly. And especially here, when we think about large distances, we're moving from 300 miles away, Salt Lake City to Washington County. The trip in and of itself, like a one-time consultative trip, if I'm down there for multiple days, it pays for itself to have the robot in one experience. So I just think about it's about kind of having these sustainable plans if you're interested in doing these, and knowing that this kind of desktop, stationary, stable format of video conferencing is great for the interactions with consultees, educators, parents, and you as the consultant. It's the dynamic part when kids move around that we really need those robots, because unfortunately, or fortunately, kids move around a ton, and we need to be able to monitor them in a really valid way. So I would look for grants. I think if you buy in bulk from any of these companies, they give pretty significant discounts as well as educational discounts. Please do a little bit more of digging if you're interested, or reach out to me, and I'm happy to share some more of my experiences around obtaining some of this hardware.
Awesome. So that looks to be the end of the questions, unless anybody has anything that I just happened to miss. Feel free to type it in as I'm kind of sending my final instructions and thoughts for you today, and we can hold those questions for tomorrow if there's something I didn't get to. So thank you all for joining us today. Please join us again tomorrow for part 2 of this workshop. It is part 2. It's going to be brand new content, different content. It's not a repeat of today. I also want to reiterate that this workshop and tomorrow's will be recorded, and we will be putting that up likely on our YouTube channel once it's ready to be posted. So look for it there. And Dr. Fisher has been incredibly generous in allowing us to make that available as a recording up there with no time limit. So I want to thank you, Aaron, for allowing us to do that. I think it's really valuable information, and will really, help particularly as COVID, I think, persists for longer than we initially anticipated for folks to have this as a resource. I do want to also note that if you signed up for CEUs, we will be processing those. We are using the attendance reports from logging in for these sessions, and we will have those reports matched up to your CEU requests, and we'll be granting CEUs based on participation. For school district folks who are doing this for points or in-service credits, we will also be following up with you, and Georgina Medeiros from Miami-Dade will follow up with you on your follow-up activity and how to make sure that you get your points. You will all also receive a certificate of attendance for today's session that you can use to submit to whoever you need to. So if there are no other questions, I want to thank Dr. Fisher again for joining us and giving us all this wonderful information. It was really fantastic to hear you talk, and we will see you all back here tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining us.